everyone's expectations of their bosses are quite different depending on the fields that you're in. I've been in many situations with my friends who have said, oh, I think my manager hates me. And when they describe the situation, I'm like, I think your manager is just having really clear boundaries around how they want to show up and how they want to be in relationship with you.
Have you ever had a manager who acted like a friend instead of your boss? They confide in you, trust you with important work, and treat you like a peer. How do you say no when you're completely overwhelmed and can't find the courage to disappoint them? I'm Ben Jackson, and this is Workface, a podcast where people finally tell the truth about work. Our guest today is Dustin Liu. Dustin is the Senior Associate Director at NYU Stern's Initiative on Purpose and Flourishing. Previously, he was the Associate Director at Stanford's Life Design Lab. For the last 3 years, he's also been a moderator at Hear Me Out, where he interviews employees about their workplace experiences. Dustin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben. So excited to have this conversation with you.
It's great to have you here. Before we get into anything, what do you think our listeners should know about you?
Maybe listeners should know that you took a chance on a grad student graduating from grad school to join Hear Me Out. And then we've been doing work together for 3 years. So just really excited to continue the conversation that we actually started for years and years and years. I feel like in every work environment that I've entered, you've always been a moderator in my own workplace. So excited to bring some of those insights into this full conversation.
I'm really excited too. I'm curious, given that you're one of the first moderators that we interviewed, what was your first impression?
I think Hear Me Out came at a really interesting moment when I was getting curious about organizational culture and how we might be able to assess what employees were feeling in the workplace. I had come off of several experiences where I was realizing how power was actually impacting employees' ability to give feedback. So being in an environment where we were able to broker those relationships felt really empowering. And I think of every project that I've done, all of those conversations were incredibly tender. And I'm just realizing how those conversations need to be had outside of any power dynamic or power-laced relationship in order for us to actually move the work forward. It's been remarkably humbling how every organization is just so fundamentally different. I know that we talk about themes all the time, but coming to the work and realizing that the process wasn't just grabbing a book off the shelf that was already written, but actually quite bespoke and quite deeply human to really start unraveling the thick culture that was in the organization has been really fun and really formative to the way that I think about organizations. Hear Me Out is just a really simple premise, having employees share their true thoughts on what's emerging for them, and just realizing how many employees that we spoke to never got asked, how are you doing really? How can your manager best support you? How is this organization serving or failing you? Felt both shocking at first, but when we understand the power dynamics that are laced in the organization, it became sort of a haven for these people, and really tender conversations started to emerge. So you noticed a need, and I'm just really glad to be part of the balm that hopefully helps an organization move forward.
Thank you. Was there anything that surprised you coming in to Hear Me Out and doing this work with us?
I mean, one, I think it's been really important for me as someone who leads qualitative research to recognize that there's so many organizations that are assessing company culture and company experiences, but don't necessarily bring a lens of research rigor. So really closing that gap between research and practice felt really important. I think the way that we approach our conversations with employees, the level of confidentiality, the level of care, and also the research methods used felt well aligned, and it actually built a lot of trust with the people that we were speaking to. Something that surprised me was honestly how emotional some of these conversations were. I mean, quite transparently, and I know that we've talked about this, there are some conversations that we've had with employees where they've shared that we were the first people to ever ask how they were doing for months and months and months in a row. So just recognizing that for many of the employees, just having a space to talk about this, maybe outside of their friendships and outside of their family relationships, but to actually start speaking in ways that might change their workplace experiences was just honestly very emotional. And I know that through our transcripts and through our own work in the process of developing actionable solutions, sometimes it's those emotions and sometimes it's those really personal stories that actually gave us some clues as to the recommendations that we could give organizations. So in no way are we being therapeutic. In no way are we diving into the depths of someone's existence. But it made me realize, and it's given me a lot of pause around feeling like work is just work. Work is a huge part of our lives. And it's important for us to consider how the workplace can actually be a place of well-being, a place of flourishing, rather than just this separate part of our lives that we put boundaries around.
That sounds like a great segue into my first question for you. So, Dustin, what do you remember about the first time you felt insecure in the workplace?
There are so many moments that flare up. When I think about the first time that I felt insecure, I've often felt insecure in the workplace when my worth is being questioned or when too much is being thrown and I don't feel like I can show up for it. And I think it comes from my own personal baggage of wanting to be successful and wanting to show up and wanting to be the best intern and wanting to do the best job that I can. And I think back to a moment where I was interning for a social impact organization, and they kept building on my work and building on my work and building on my work because I kept finishing these tasks and it was meeting their expectations. And I never felt like I could say, I've had enough, or this is actually outside of my bandwidth, or this is too much, or this is outside of my scope. And I remember in every conversation with my manager, I would just feel like I just had to nod and just swallow and take it down. And I think back and I, in the moment, saw it as me wanting to perform and do a great job. There was a period where I thought, oh, like maybe I was just fearful. But now looking back, and as you asked this question, it's actually just a period of insecurity. I didn't feel like I had status. I didn't feel like I had anything to point to that could prove my worth. So all I could do was to show up and do a tour of an absolute, just a tour of strength and a tour of perseverance in order to prove that I was worthwhile.
What do you wish that your manager had said to you when you first joined that job?
I think there's a really interesting moment for young professionals when your name becomes synonymous with capable. Like, hey, like that's a capable person. And I think it's a really slippery slope because as soon as that happens, it actually creates a lot of dynamics that I think are quite unhealthy for young people who are entering the workplace. What I mean by that is managers may feel a sense of relief or may feel a sense of allyship or may feel a sense of almost friendship. And I found that in many of my early work experiences, my relationships turned into friendships quite quickly. And I wish my manager set some clear boundaries and clearer checkpoints just to allow me to be a little bit more forthcoming. I think, especially when there is a power differential or you're new to an organization or a field, there's this need to perform and there's this need to show up. And I wish my manager knew that. And now looking back, and as I'm saying that out loud, Ben, like I don't know how my manager could have read my mind, but I wish she had just asked, hey, you're doing a lot of work. How are you feeling about it? I got a lot of positive feedback. I got a lot of excitement around the work that I was producing. I got a lot of positivity from the organization. But now thinking back, I don't think I was ever asked, how are you doing? It was always about the work that I was producing.
Do you think you would have been honest about how you were feeling if your manager had asked?
I think if I was asked enough times, I think it would have come out. I don't think it would have happened the first 2 or 3 times that I was asked, but there's something about having more consistent check-ins that makes it feel a little bit less of a risk. And what I mean by that is I recognize that these conversations around being forthcoming with some of your emotions and some of your experiences with your manager can feel quite challenging. But when you have these check-ins that are quite consistent, it allows the ability to bring things up a little bit more gradually rather than having like an ultimatum conversation that this needs to stop and this needs to end. And there were just so many things and so many individual moments that were paper cuts, I'll say, throughout my time that could have been quickly communicated, but I never knew that I had a space or that I had a moment to do that.
You know, one thing that this is bringing up for me is trust. And I find it really interesting that, when you talk about your relationship to that manager, you described it almost as being friends.
Totally.
Yeah, and theoretically, friends have trust, right? Theoretically, friends can confide in each other. And yet, this wasn't exactly a friendship because this was not just your friend. They were also someone who held power over your career. And I guess I'm wondering, how can a manager develop trust with their direct reports without falling into a situation where they blur the lines between being their boss and being their friend? Because it seems like the friend part does not automatically translate to the trust part, and in fact can be counterproductive by blurring those lines.
I so appreciate this question because I see this all the time. And I don't know if it's a function of growing up in a social impact space or growing up in a higher ed environment, but it's such a collegial environment that friendships emerge. And I have found time and time again these tricky moments, especially between managers and direct reports, where boundaries are blurred, where just even sharing your feelings about the work can make people feel uncomfortable or it can make people feel tense, where there is a generosity that's extended that maybe extends past the workplace. All to say, this question is something that I'm still wrestling with, right? How do you maintain a friendship with your boss while also maintaining some boundaries when that boss has decision power over your work, decision power over how you will be compensated, how you will be evaluated, how you will be performing? When I talk to my peers, there's a lot of trepidation and there's a lot of fear around crossing those boundaries because you don't want to make it weird and you don't want to make it stressful. And I think it's been interesting that, I always talk about my friends being like friends from work, and my friends will oftentimes use the word colleague, like, oh, like I work with them, they're a colleague. At least in the fields and the offices that I've worked in, the work is so immersive and you're part of a community and you're going to meetings and you're working together every day. I've just seen so many situations where a manager friendship and a direct report friendship devolves because you're not necessarily sure when you're wearing the friend hat. You're not necessarily sure when you're wearing a manager hat, and those conversations can be quite tense. That's a non-answer, Ben, because I think it's something that I'm still thinking about. How do we actually build workplace friendships that don't get in the way of our ability to create high-performing and functional teams?
It's a perennial problem.
It's totally a perennial problem. I'm curious, when you think about your own management style, Ben, not to turn it around on you, were you friends with your employees?
No.
No.
No. One of the first things that I learned about management was that your boss can't be your friend. And that was a conversation that I have with every single one of my direct reports from the beginning. And I would say, look, I'm your boss, and that means I can't be your friend.
I can't know everything, right? There are things that you can't tell me. There are things that I don't want to know. There are things that I don't want to see. And then there are things that are really important for us to keep a distance on.
Yeah, that was I think what I was trying to communicate with my reports, was that there are limits to our relationship. I'm not going to invite you to my birthday party as your manager because I don't know whether you're showing up to my party because you want to be there or because I'm your boss. And, I think it can be very challenging, especially in small, tight-knit teams, especially teams that are, as some managers like to say, in the trenches.
Yeah, totally.
With each other, right? Where you're going through a lot, you're bonding through this really difficult experience. It can be really difficult to separate the boss relationship from the friend relationship. And so I always try to make that implicit separation very, very explicit for my direct reports, so that they would not confuse the nature of our relationship, because friends don't fire friends.
Friends don't fire friends. It's so true. I mean, Ben, what you're describing brings up for me how so many people aren't trained to be managers. The fact that you had someone to reach out to and you had books to read is a beautiful example of mentorship in action. But we don't mentor managers. Manager trainings don't get into the complexities of what we're talking about. And I think just everyone's expectations of their bosses are quite different depending on the fields that you're in. I'm just realizing how contextual and how frame-based it is. I mean, in a nonprofit, in a small team, in a startup, right? There are so many different form factors of how managers might look. And when an organization starts quite flat and then becomes quite hierarchical, right? Even that transition point might change how friendships were emerging in the first place. What I'm hearing in what you were saying that I really appreciate is this idea of clarity. Right? What does it mean to be really clear with expectations on both sides? What does it mean to feel very clear on the boundaries that you want to set, the accountability that you want to set, the integrity that you want to set? Because when those things are left unsaid, I've been in many situations with my friends who have said, oh, I think my manager hates me. And when they describe the situation, I'm like, I think your manager is just having really clear boundaries around how they want to show up and how they want to be in relationship with you.
Yeah. I'm curious, because your work at NYU has to do with flourishing in the workplace.
Yeah.
Have you worked with leaders through the organization?
We've worked with a variety of different leaders leading different groups. And, I've gotten to a point where I've realized that flourishing, well-being, employee engagement, employee retention will look different in every organization, even in similar fields. I've had these conversations with leaders around what flourishing might look like for their organizations. We've talked to healthcare organizations where flourishing for their doctors and their employees looks very different than flourishing for large tech companies that are primarily staffed by software engineers. Just the mere concept of what flourishing looks like is quite different. Their needs are quite different. The context is quite different. The stressors are different. And the interventions, as a result, are of course, quite different. We were talking to a startup that had recently gone through an extreme period of growth. And they were talking about employee flourishing. And their concept of employee flourishing really relied on amenities. Like, what does it mean for us to have work from home options? What does it mean for us to really maintain that we're not going to return to the office? What does it mean for us to have in the office all the services that you would need to stay at the office? What does it mean for us to have kombucha on tap?
It sounds like a lot of material things.
Material things, right? And then we talk to other organizations that are much more focused on fit and resilience. And what I mean by that is we've talked to some engineering firms where they have folks who are working in the field for very long hours, from early in the morning to late at night. And their idea of flourishing is to give their employees the tools that they need to persevere, the tools that they need to be resilient, the tools that they need to access resources when they need it, the training that they need to really communicate with their managers around their expectations and what they need, and most importantly, whether or not they can complete the tasks, being really honest in those fields. Compare that to like emerging conversations that we're having with a design architecture firm. Very, very long hours, craft-based, laced with, all the dynamics that you can imagine from a design space where there are design critiques and there's power laced in the organization and there's sort of a design language that you need to align with. Flourishing can look very different in that environment because the work is hard. There's an expectation of that. There's a field level commitment to that work being needed to be exact and to be articulate and to be creative and to be new. I share all of that just to give different lenses to the idea that flourishing in organizations really relies on what the employees or what the staff or what the organization needs. And the way that I think about it is how can we have a really functional organization while also maintaining this idea of employee well-being, right? What does it mean for us to really center this idea of making sure that there's a strong expectation that's set for what the employer is going to provide and the expectations of the employee? I think many of these challenges emerge, or many of the rhetoric reality gaps emerge, when the organization isn't clear on their purpose, where the individual is not clear on their purpose or why they're there, or if there is a gap in terms of an understanding of what the experience actually feels like to work at that organization.
Something that's occurring to me, and we talked a little bit about this in the call before this call, is that the word flourishing is pretty overdetermined. There are a lot of different meanings that it can take. For example, you've got virtue ethics, right? The Aristotelian idea that flourishing means developing excellence of character and practicing virtues, fulfilling our nature as rational beings. You've got the Ayn Randian objectivist definition of flourishing as pursuing individual goals, achieving authentic self-creation, right? It's all about being selfish. You've even got the Stoic definition of flourishing, which is cultivating wisdom and self-control, accepting what we can't change. And I'm really curious, does the center have a preferred definition? Is the center normative in that sense? Or do you really let each organization that comes to you bring their own definition of flourishing?
I mean, what a good question. This is something that we're still wrestling with. The initiative recently started just a few months ago, and we're still really defining what purpose and flourishing mean to us. We've started to engage a variety of different faculty members and leaders in the field. And of course, there are a few themes around flourishing, around well-being, around feeling as though you have a sense of agency, a feeling of meaning, and you are worthy. I mean, these are all things that have come up in the literature, but where I stand right now is that every organization may define it differently. Every individual may define it differently. So the goals of the initiative right now is to hopefully move towards an operational definition. But as of right now, it's such a big word. What does it actually mean? It means very different things to different organizations.
It's so challenging. And, when you talk about the gap between rhetoric and reality, my experience listening to employees complain about how their company says one thing and does another is that oftentimes that gap is precisely the result of these overdetermined words. What does it mean to have a high-performing team? What does it mean to build a great place to work? What does great mean? Great means a lot of different things to different people, right?
Yeah.
One of the tensions that's occurring to me as we talk through this is what happens when an individual's flourishing is in tension with a team's flourishing, or when a team's flourishing is in tension with the organization flourishing.
Yeah.
How does the leader reconcile that tension when they don't match
Yeah.
up?
Let's take a really particular example. The idea of return to office, right? This concept that many individuals are naming publicly that a return to office would be not additive to their well-being, that would work against their well-being. It would decrease their flexibility. It would disrupt some patterns that have already been built over the past 4 years. So this return to office order feels very disruptive. Then we have teams that are saying that we need to collaborate in person, but many of my friends and my colleagues are saying that they're going into the office and just jumping onto Zoom calls all day with people who are working from around the world or people who are working on different floors. And then you have this idea from a systems perspective or an organizational perspective that we want to increase shareholder value, and they feel like people are being less engaged and people are being less productive in the workplace. So recognizing that there may be truths and non-truths in all of those statements, how do you manage those tensions? If you were a CEO, what would you do? If you were a manager, what would you do? And these are the questions that we wrestle with our stakeholders and our partners every day, right? What does it mean to make the right decision? And it comes down, I think, to company values, company mission, and company vision, right? If you have very clear values, if you have very clear mission and vision, if you have expectations that you've named quite clearly to employees, there needs to be a reason why this is happening. It can't just feel willy-nilly. We're seeing that these decisions often come without an explanation. And I think the missing explanation is what frustrates folks.
One of the challenges that I see with a lot of leaders is that oftentimes the truth cannot be spoken plainly because the truth, if spoken plainly, is not palatable to the people who need to hear it. And one of the ways that I see organizations dance around the truth is in the way that they state their values.
I love that you're bringing up this idea of company values. I think oftentimes these values are, on posters and our own websites, but what does it actually look like for these values to show up in practice? For a long time, I actually really struggled with company and organizational values because I wasn't really sure how they contributed to anything that we were doing in the organization. I felt very much so that the organization is created by these interpersonal interactions and the ways in which managers were leading and the ways in which goals were being set. But in actuality, clear values are everything. And I really believe that. Having clear values that the company believes in, that are communicated, that are amplified, that are shared in the organization, having that shared language, having these snippets of lines that are used to describe company culture, I think it's so incredibly potent. And when I think about how many organizations have values that are either flimsy, not activated, or, to use language that I've learned from you, thought terminating cliches that sort of just leave people hanging. What does that mean for an employee trying to make sense of a decision that's come out? What does that mean for an employee who's struggling to figure out if they're well aligned with an organization? Part of the initiative's work is to encourage organizations to get really clear about those values and find ways in which those values actually show up in the organization.
I love where you're going with this. And I think what's occurring to me is that it's not just about clarity, but it's also about specificity. And the rub is that for a lot of organizations, as soon as you get specific, all of a sudden you are cutting off some of your options. And I think that for many leaders, the impulse to preserve their optionality is something that is really deeply embedded in how they were taught to lead. Is that something that you've seen?
To answer that question, I'll share a short story. I was talking to a startup founder who said that a value isn't really a value until you lose money over it, right? What does it mean to actually sacrifice over a value? And I think that's getting to the point that you're saying. If values are broad enough where all possible futures can fit into those value structures, how is that value actually supporting you in making a decision? And rhetoric reality gaps then become very common, right? We're saying that we have a value of this, but we're doing that because it's a broad enough term that everything fits under it.
One of the things that I have tried to instill in the leaders that we work with is that when people are unhappy or frustrated or otherwise just not flourishing, there are reasons. And the leader might not agree with those reasons, but the feelings are real. And that it's incumbent upon the people with the power to make changes to the workplace, to lead with curiosity, to understand not only what people are feeling, but why they feel that way. Not only what they believe, but why they believe it. And to the extent that they can, to the extent that it's in their power, to make the changes that those people need to see in order to feel better. You know, it's funny, when I tell people what I do, when I first meet them, one of the things that often happens is they'll say, oh my God, and they just start unloading all of their baggage on me from their last job. And when I ask people, you know, so why did you leave? What was the last straw for you? They give a bunch of different reasons, but their reasons typically boil down to the same thing, which is, I no longer believe that my leaders are taking me seriously. Every leader wants their people to act like owners, and yet I find it so rare for leaders to treat them like owners.
So this idea of equal partnership invites us to consider new ways of management, new ways of constructing organizations, possibilities that emerge when we change the way that we actually function in our relationship between managers and direct reports, between shareholders and company leaders. I think it's an opportunity as we're coming out of, I would say, a moment of extreme disruption from COVID, where we're trying to figure out what a new normal might be, and sort of what I'm feeling as a pendulum shift towards a new focus on moving things back to the way things were, quote unquote, before COVID. I'm seeing some thoughtful leaders really take this moment to reimagine what might be possible. And I just feel so grateful to be in an initiative, to be at a business school that is really centering what it looks like to highlight positive deviances and hopefully uplift best practices and case studies of leaders who are moving organizations towards these values of purpose and flourishing.
What are some of the ways that they are doing that? Help our listeners and their bosses.
I'll give a specific anecdote around multi-generational work. There's been a lot of rhetoric around Gen Z being lazy, Gen Z not showing up to work, Gen Z not being engaged, how they're not sure what happened, they're not as prepared. I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric around negative perception of the contributions that this generation is making into the workplace. And the most important conversations that I've had with leaders is asking the question, have you spoken to them? What do they need? And to bring us in a roundabout way, I think in many ways, in the spirit of hear me out, I think it actually starts with being open to hearing feedback, about being open to hearing human needs, about being open to understanding what differences and what affordances this generation brings. And I feel that way about all sorts of issues and topics. It really starts by centering voices. It starts by centering experiences and getting really curious in the way that we think about our values around what the workplace needs in this moment. Because with technological disruption, with AI advancement, I mean, there's so many things that we can point to. This way of working is probably not going to be sustained. What got us here will not get us there, I think is the larger message that I'm hoping to share. And the leaders that are getting very curious and are taking bold steps to really reimagine what growth, what development, what learning, what operating principles might look like are the ones that I think will actually emerge stronger after this level of disruption.
That feels like a wonderful place for us to finish up the episode. Just a couple more questions before I let you go.
Go for it.
So where can our listeners find you on the internet?
Listeners can find more information about the NYU Stern Initiative on Purpose and Flourishing by going to our website. If you just type in NYU Stern Initiative on Purpose and Flourishing, it will come up. And then myself personally, I'm super open to connecting with folks on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out.
All right. Is there anything you haven't had a chance to share and think we should know?
I think people should know that Ben is a good manager and he's been very clear about his expectations. So in many ways, Ben is a positive deviance in my book. So thank you for letting me be part of your universe and for letting me moderate for Hear Me Out.
Dustin Liu, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it.
Workface is produced by Hear Me Out, a culture strategy firm for leaders with the courage to listen. Our consulting producer is Lena Misitsis. Original music by me, Ben Jackson. Special thanks to Rob McRae and Michelle Matar. To learn more about Hear Me Out, visit hearmeout.co, follow us on Instagram at hearmeout_co, or find us on LinkedIn by searching for Hear Me Out.